Hi. Montana, January. The wind howled like a dying beast as snow hammered the hills, burying the pines in silence. Elvin Tucker stood inside his cabin, sharpening his axe by firelight, when a pounding rattled the door, once, then twice more. He opened it. A woman stood in the storm, cloaked in rags, belly swollen with child. Her lips were cracked, her eyes fierce. "You Elvin?" she asked, voice hoarse. "They sent me to cook. There's no way back." She stepped forward, one hand on her belly, the other clutching a threadbare rucksack. Elvin said nothing, just stared, then moved aside. Slowly, she passed into the warmth. Snow melted from her cloak, pooled on the floor. The door shut behind her with a final thud. Elvin's hand lingered near the axe handle. Not from fear, from knowing. The world had shifted. Change had come. Elvin Tucker lived in the hills like a shadow that no longer cast light. 8 years had passed since the fever took Annie and their son Josiah. Came in the spring rains, quiet at first, just a cough, a flush in the cheeks. Then the wheezing, the sweating, the shaking. He buried them beneath the aspen grove, where sunlight still dared to fall. Since then, only silence, the kind that settles in the bones. He built the cabin with his own hands, stacked every log, chinked every gap. When the grief grew sharp, he chopped trees until his arms bled. When memory stole sleep, he hiked the ridge by moonlight, muttering to ghosts. He learned not to speak unless needed, learned not to need. His neighbors in town, what few there were, spoke of him in hushed tones. "Elvin the widow," they'd say. Wilderness took more than his kin. He heard them once loading flour at the supply store. Didn't respond. He never did. By winter's turn, the weight of solitude had carved him down to sinew and silence. His days were simple: wake, chop, eat, mend, sleep. No questions, no voices, no kindness. He hadn't hired a cook for company. He'd hired her because his joints cracked now when he stirred heavy pots. Because he'd grown tired of burnt beans and sour coffee. Because a man gets older even when time feels stuck. But when he opened the door and saw her, Rose Martin, belly round as a drum, hair stiff with frost, he felt something stir that he hadn't let move in years. Not sympathy, not fear, just the sense that everything was about to tilt. She didn't smile, didn't shiver, just stepped in like she'd done it before. She dropped the sack near the stove, lowered herself slowly onto the bench, and pulled her boots off with a groan. Elvin watched her without speaking. She didn't look up. "I don't need soft," she muttered. "Just a stove and time." He gave her both. But as he sat back down and reached for his carving knife, his hand trembled slightly. She hadn't asked his permission. She hadn't thanked him. She hadn't cried. She simply arrived. And Elvin, who'd made a religion of control, felt the first crack in the altar he'd built to silence. By the third day, the snow eased. Not enough to melt, but enough to see sky between gusts. Elvin watched Rose work. She moved slow, heavy, with the caution of someone who'd lived through pain and didn't trust comfort. Her back curved wrong when she bent to the stove. Each breath seemed earned. Still, she never asked for help. She cooked in silence, cleaned in silence, ate little, spoke less. At night, he heard her shift on the cot by the fire, heard the soft catch in her throat, the sound of a woman crying into the sleeve of her coat. Quiet enough to be missed, but not by him. She wore a ring on a chain, not on her finger but close to her skin. When she thought he wasn't looking, her thumb rubbed over it again and again. He didn't ask. She didn't offer. On the 7th morning, she didn't rise. Elvin knocked gently on the wall beside her cot. "You sick?" Silence. He stepped in. She lay curled, her face pale, sweat beading at her hairline. Her breath came ragged. He knelt, placed a hand on her forehead, burning. "Rose," he said, firmer. She opened her eyes. "I'm fine." "You're not." "I said I'm fine." But her voice cracked, brittle as pine in frost. He fetched willow bark tea, the kind his wife used to brew, and set it by her bed. She didn't thank him, just drank, slow and stubborn. The color returned, but barely. By nightfall, she was coughing deep, wet sounds that scraped the air. That was the first time he touched her without thinking. Sat beside her, lifted her up, held the cup to her lips. She let him. No protest, no pride, just trust. "I can work tomorrow," she rasped. "No, I didn't come here to be pitied." "You think this is pity?" He leaned back. "This is practicality. You die, I'm stuck burning beans again." She almost smiled at that. Almost. The next day, she rose, swaying but determined. He returned from chopping wood to find the floor swept, the pot boiling, and her sleeves rolled to the elbows. "I said rest," he growled. "I said I can work." They stared at each other. Then she winced, grabbed her back, and sat hard on the stool. "I just need a day or two. The weight's bad now. I wasn't supposed to walk this far, not in winter." He crouched beside her, studying her face. "Why did you?" She didn't answer right away. Then, "Because there was nowhere else. My husband." He got into a fight with a soldier. Officer came to collect tax from his brother, rough like they do. Hit me when I stepped in. John. He knocked the man cold. She paused. "They hanged him 2 weeks later. Said it was justice." Her hand touched the chain at her throat. "I buried him with nothing. They wouldn't even let me keep the house. Said it belonged to the army now. So I took what I could carry. And they sent you here. They said Tucker was hiring. Said he didn't ask questions. That he had food and no opinions." Elvin stood slowly. Something about that twisted in his chest. Not guilt. Not yet. But something close. That night, she slept soundly for the first time. He watched from the doorway, the way her hand rested on her belly, protective even in dreams. He thought about the fever that had taken Josiah, about how Annie used to hum lullabies long after the child had fallen asleep. He reached for his coat and stepped outside, walking the path to the woodshed without lantern or axe. He wasn't there to work. He just needed the cold. She came for bread, not pity. But she brought grief with her, and Elvin knew the shape of it too well. In the silence of snow and fir trees, he whispered to no one, "She won't make it alone." Not a promise, just a fact. And in the dark, he knew. He wasn't going to let her try. It started with things not said. Elvin began leaving a steaming mug of boiled willow bark tea on the table each morning before Rose stirred from her cot. He cut her firewood smaller, easier to carry, and left it neatly stacked near the stove. He patched a rip in her cloak where the seam had frayed, the thread matching so perfectly she almost missed it. These weren't acts of charity, not in his mind. They were gestures, a man's way of speaking when words had become too heavy to lift. Rose noticed them all, but she didn't thank him. She never commented, never changed her tone. She just sipped the tea slower, bent less stiffly when collecting wood. And every now and then, when she thought he wasn't looking, she smiled. Still, they barely spoke. Their conversations, when they happened, were functional, quiet. She asked where the beans were kept. He nodded toward the shelf. She mentioned the stew had too much salt. He shrugged. It was how they lived. 1 hour at a time, side by side, never closer. Then came the blizzard. It swept down from the high ridges like something alive, howling and relentless. Snow choked the trail and buried the fence posts. The wind screamed across the chimney top like it wanted inside. Elvin secured the shutters, doubled the firewood pile, boiled extra water, and hung blankets between rooms to conserve heat. The storm lasted 3 days. On the 3rd night, it happened. He was lying on his cot near the wall, half awake, listening to the wind rattle the eaves. Then a cry, a sharp, guttural sound, cut through the dark. Not the wind, not the house groaning, a human sound. He was on his feet in seconds, heart thudding. She was doubled over near the stove, one hand braced on the bench, the other gripping her belly. "Elvin," she gasped. "It's happening." He blinked. "The baby. What else would it be?" Her voice broke. "It's too early." She staggered back to the cot. He caught her by the elbow and eased her down. "How far apart?" he asked. "I don't know. I wasn't timing them. I didn't think it'd be now. Elvin's mouth was dry. He moved fast, boiling water, laying down extra rags, clearing space near the fire. He fetched the worn old manual from Annie's trunk. Field Notes for Midwives, 1873. Its edges curled from years of use. He opened it to the childbirth section and began reading aloud. Keep mother warm, calm. Offer clean water. Prepare for prolonged labor. Do not leave her side. He glanced at her. I won't. Rose breathed through another contraction, jaw clenched. You ever done this before? Elvin hesitated. Once. She looked at him, and in her expression was something close to understanding. Your wife. He nodded. I'm not her, Rose whispered. I know, he said softly. She cried out again, her body arching with pain. Elvin knelt beside her, holding her hand as if it might anchor her to the world. Hours passed in gasps and whispers, in boiling water and cold cloths, in murmured instructions and held breath. Elvin read from the book in a low, steady voice. His hands shook, but never enough to drop what he carried. At one point, Rose sobbed, I can't do it. He wiped her brow with a trembling cloth. You already are. I don't want to die. You won't. I don't want him to grow up alone. He won't. Another contraction ripped through her and she screamed. He didn't flinch, just held on. When the worst of it passed, she sagged against the cot, shivering. I didn't plan for this, she said. Neither did I. I thought I'd be alone. You're not. She gripped his wrist suddenly. Thank you. He swallowed hard. Don't thank me yet. Time folded. The storm outside grew fainter, or maybe they stopped noticing it. All that existed was breath, pain, heat, and the beating of two exhausted hearts. Then, near dawn, it happened. A child's cry filled the cabin, piercing and shrill and impossibly alive. Elvin stood frozen, his hands slick with water, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. He looked down at the infant in his arms. Red-faced, small-fisted, perfect. He wrapped the baby in a towel and placed him in Rose's trembling hands. She cradled the boy to her chest and sobbed. Not the tight, hidden sobs of grief, but deep, broken cries of something else. Relief, joy, survival. Elvin sank to the floor beside her, resting his back against the wall. His own eyes burned, and for the first time in years, he let them. He let the tears fall, not for pain, not for Annie, but for what he thought was gone forever, hope. She whispered, His name is Brennan. Elvin nodded. The fire crackled behind them. The wind, at last, quieted. Outside, the snow still fell, but gently now. Inside, a new sound had replaced the storm. The breathing of three people who had survived. Rose fell asleep with the baby on her chest, hand curled protectively around him. Elvin sat nearby, watching the rise and fall of the infant's tiny chest, the flicker of his lips, the way his hand gripped his mother's dress like he already knew she was his world. Elvin stood after a while, knees stiff. He collected the bloody linens, the towels, the half-spilled bowl of water, and took them outside, burying the worst of it beneath the snow where no wolves would come. When he came back in, he paused by the fire, watched them, then he moved to the rocker and sat down. He stared into the flames and felt something open inside him. Some rusted door, long jammed shut, now creaking wide in the warmth. He remembered Annie's voice, faint but unmistakable, echoing from some distant corner of memory. When a child cries, the world starts over. He used to scoff at that. Not anymore. Spring thawed the land in slow breaths. Snow retreated from the roots first, then the hilltops, then the trails. The creek behind the cabin swelled with meltwater, rushing past mossy stones like it was late for something. Sap rose in the trees. Birds returned. Wild crocus pushed through the mud. Inside, Elvin sanded the last edge of the crib. He ran his thumb along the rail, satisfied with its smoothness. It wasn't perfect. The joints were uneven, and one leg wobbled when Brennan kicked too hard. But it held. So did the boy. He was louder now, louder every day. kicking, squealing, discovering the shape of his own voice. He liked to grip things. Rose's braid, Elvin's finger, the corner of the wool blanket that had once belonged to Annie. Sometimes Elvin would wake in the middle of the night to the weight of Brennan on his chest, breathing warm and steady, and forget, for one heartbeat, that he was a man who'd buried a son. Then he'd remember, and instead of pain, there was something else, something like peace. Rose moved easier now too. Her limp had faded, her color returned. She sang, sometimes under her breath while stirring soup or folding clothes. She never called him Elvin, not aloud. She called him you, or him, or nothing at all. But when she laughed, it was always louder if he was near. He didn't press, didn't ask. But every day she moved closer, until one day trouble came riding. It was a Thursday, the sky clear, the air smelling of pine needles and wet earth. Elvin was splitting logs near the fence when he spotted the figure on horseback, winding up the trail. Alone, government saddle, coat pressed flat, one glinting badge on the breast. He didn't call for Rose. Didn't need to. She was already at the window, holding Brennan tighter. The rider didn't slow. Elvin stepped to the porch, axe still in hand. The man stopped 10 feet from the steps. "Elvin Tucker?" he called. "I am." The rider dismounted. He was tall, thin, and angular, like something starved into duty. He unlatched a leather satchel from his side and withdrew a folded paper. "Calvin Brody, Federal Oversight Officer, Registry out of Helena." Elvin didn't extend his hand. "What do you want?" "We've received unregistered census reports. One adult female, one minor child. No civil documentation." "You rode all this way for that?" Brody didn't smile. Under Section 4 of the Settlement Order, households outside city limits must report all non-blood residents. Failure to comply is considered obstruction. "She's a cook," Elvin said plainly. Brody raised a brow. "She live here? She works here. Does she leave?" "She can." Brody looked at the window, at the shape of Rose standing just beyond the curtain, rocking slowly. "There's a child," he said. Elvin said nothing. Brody stepped closer. "Is it yours? You asking by law or curiosity?" "By the book." "Then you'll need better ink than that." Brody unfolded the document, offered it. Elvin didn't take it. The officer adjusted his gloves. Under Montana civil law, any child born within a household where no marriage license is present must be registered as a ward of the state, especially if the mother has no claim of property, income, or kinship. "She's not a ward," Elvin said, voice hardening. "No," Brody replied. "But the child can be." Elvin took a slow step forward. "You threatening to take him?" "I'm telling you," Brody said, unblinking. "If you don't make this legal, someone else will." A silence stretched, taut and brittle. Then Brennan cried from inside. A short, sharp sound, more like a question than a need. Brody glanced toward the cabin. "That the boy?" Elvin's hands were still, but his eyes darkened like distant thunder. "You're going to want to step back." Brody didn't move. "I'm not here to make enemies, Mr. Tucker. I'm here to enforce order. You've got 7 days. Either marry the woman, file for adoption, or release the child into temporary custody. Those are your options. What happens if I don't choose?" "I choose for you." Another silence. Brody folded the paper again, tucked it back into the satchel. "Expect me next Friday." He turned and mounted without another word. By the time Elvin stepped back inside, Rose had laid Brennan in the crib. She stood by the fire, arms crossed, face unreadable. "I heard," she said. Elvin nodded. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not yours. And Brennan's not either. You're both here. That doesn't mean." "It means enough." She looked away, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. "I came to cook," she said quietly. "Not to become someone's reason to get arrested. You came for shelter. You stayed for survival. That makes us both more than what we planned." She stepped closer to the fire, but not to him. "What happens now?" Elvin looked at her. Really looked. At the scar near her eye. At the hair she tried to keep pinned but always lost. At the way her shoulders never fully lowered, even in peace. "I don't know yet," he said, and meant it. The next morning, Elvin rose before dawn. He didn't wake Rose, just stepped outside, boots crunching through the last crust of spring frost. He carried the box down from the attic himself, hadn't touched it in years. Inside, old letters, Annie's brooch, a tintype photo cracked at the edges, and the ring, silver, smoothed by time, his mother's, never worn by Annie. Too small for her hands, she used to say, but she kept it. Always said, maybe one day it'll fit someone else. He held it for a long time, turning it in the early light. Then he set it on the table and left it there. When Rose woke, she found it waiting. She didn't touch it. Not at first. Just stood at the threshold, Brennan in her arms, eyes on the soft glint of metal. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Instead, the day passed quietly. They worked the garden. Brennan slept twice, cried once. A storm teased the horizon, but never came. That evening, Elvin sat on the porch sharpening a blade when she stepped outside. The ring glinted in her palm. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "I know. I didn't come here looking to be someone's wife. I didn't come here expecting to feel again," he said. "But I do." She sat beside him. Wind moved through the trees like breath. "I'm scared," she said. "So am I. I don't want to belong to a man." "You won't. You'll belong to yourself. But you'll stand next to me, if that's what you want." She looked down at the ring, then at Brennan, asleep in her arms, then at him. "I'm not giving you a wedding," she said. "Not now. Not to satisfy some officer or law." "I'm not asking for a ceremony," he replied. "I'm offering a choice." "And what are we if I say yes?" Elvin smiled gently. "Survivors, who chose each other." She nodded once, and slid the ring onto her finger. It didn't fit perfectly, but it stayed. 2 days before the deadline, Elvin saddled his mare and rode to town. The trip was long, 12 miles of thawing trail and muddy switchbacks, but his purpose steadied him. At the courthouse, he filled out the license himself, hand tight but sure. When the clerk asked where the bride was, he simply said, "Home, with our son." The clerk raised an eyebrow, but stamped the paper. He rode next to the midwife's cabin, found her in the garden. "I need a name," he said, "for a birth that didn't get one." She narrowed her eyes. "How late?" "For months." She frowned. "That'll cost." He nodded and laid down a handful of coins. "It's worth more than it looks." Back at the cabin, he handed Rose the papers that evening. Marriage certificate, Brennan's registration, everything signed. She looked at them, then at him. He said nothing. Instead, he placed a folded handkerchief on the table. Inside was the ring, polished now, a little brighter. "You didn't ask to be a wife," he said, "but you became my grace." She picked up the ring and held it, not like an object, but like a truth. A quiet vow passed without ceremony. When Brody returned, he barely crossed the threshold. "Elvin Tucker," he began, holding out another form. "You've had." Elvin handed him the documents. Marriage, child, household census. The officer scanned them, jaw tightening. "You did all this for her?" "No," Elvin said. "I did it for us." Brody stared a moment longer, then tipped his hat. "This stays legal and I stay gone." "That'll do," Elvin replied. The door closed. The rider left, and peace for the first time stayed. A year passed. The hills softened. Grass grew tall along the creek, and pine needles blanketed the cabin's roof in silence. The place that once held only echoes now held a family. The garden thrived. Tomatoes climbed wooden stakes. Beans curled in tight green spirals. Rows of onions stood neatly in line, their heads nodding in the breeze. Brennan wandered barefoot between them, hands sticky with earth, giggling when the wind tickled his curls. Inside, the house had changed. Rose kept it warm with the smell of bread and rosemary. She hummed lullabies that had no words. She moved with ease now, no longer glancing at the door when someone knocked, even if they rarely did. Her eyes, once always searching, now stayed still, watching Brennan, watching Elvin, watching the life she had helped build, one morning at a time. Elvin worked slower these days, not because he was older, but because he no longer needed to hurry. He chopped wood methodically, fixed the roof, fished at the creek's bend, and in the evenings, after supper and stories and sleep, he carved. One night, he presented her with a second rocking chair. Simple, sturdy, sanded smooth along every curve. He'd built it to match his own, but this one was smaller, lighter, made for her. Beneath the top rail, he had carved with his finest chisel, "Home isn't a place, it's how you said my name." She ran her fingers over the words and said nothing. The next morning, she set the chair beside his and rocked in it while Brennan played in the dirt. And when Elvin brought her coffee, she smiled in a way that made his chest ache. That evening, as the sky turned gold behind the trees, they sat on the porch with Brennan between them. The boy had fallen asleep curled on Elvin's leg, one hand clutching his father's thumb, the other tangled in Rose's shawl. A small, perfect wait. They didn't speak for a long time. The birds did the talking, chirping from the pines. The wind answered through the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a fox barked once, sharp and brief, like a question. Rose leaned into Elvin's shoulder. "You saved me," she said. He didn't look at her. He looked at the land, at the hills beyond the trees, at the river glinting in the last light. Then he whispered, "Now we're both saved." They rocked together as the stars came, slow and steady. Their chairs creaked in rhythm, two heartbeats wrapped in wood. And there, beneath the darkening sky, wrapped in peace and silence, they finally belonged. Not by law, not by birth, but by choice, by grace, by love found after ruin. A family, unwritten, unpromised, and unshakably real. Bye-bye.